On today's show, we have our guest, David Goa, and we're going to be talking about the Orthodox Church view on the death penalty, on crime and punishment, and on war. Is there such a thing as a just war, or are we pacifists? What does the Orthodox Church actually teach? David Goa?
Well, you've offered a problematic set of things, haven't you, today?
I'm just doing my job.
Let's talk about them one at a time.
Okay.
So, crime and punishment, and capital punishment.
Mm-hmm.
We have to appreciate that when the church in its history, in its first 300 years, the Christian communities, the people of the way, were understood to be dangerous to the state. The Roman emperor was very concerned about them. And the early Christians were, from a Roman perspective, often judged as criminals, because after all, they wouldn't burn incense to the emperor. They refused to declare the emperor as deity. That's not as remote an idea as we often think. Certainly, if you ask people directly, is the state the deity? Most often they would say, no, it is not. But if you examine their attitude towards it, to what extent do you give a kind of ultimate meaning to the state? That brings us much closer to understanding what that early Roman issue was about. So we have to remember that within the history of the church, its first 300 years, many, many Christians were criminals from the perspective of the state. Criminality is a state issue. The church is interested in what it means to live a holy life. And that's a whole nother matter. So it's also so interesting to me with this question that you ask. We need to remember, and we need to remember it soberly, that Jesus Christ was condemned to death. Capital punishment was applied to Jesus Christ. He was hung on the cross. So, within the early history of Christianity, after Constantine lifted the pogroms, lifted the persecution, if my memory serves me, Constantine also, at least in many cases, issued capital punishment. And we have seen in Orthodox countries that ebb and flow as to whether those countries make use of capital punishment or not. But we must remember that when we speak of an Orthodox country, that's a sociological term. It's not a term about the church, much less about the faith. Because no country is Christian. Countries are states, have their particular agendas and their particular way of seeing things. So it becomes very problematic when we think of a country as Christian. And I would say when we think of it as Orthodox. So all governments, have a responsibility for good order. And they implement that in a variety of ways. And they also implement it usually in a way which is to the benefit of certain people within the society, and probably not to the benefit of others in that society. That's sort of what we call the way of the world. It's the way life works in the world. In some ways, the Christian church is always called to be counterculture to that. The Christian church is always called not to be engaged in the exercise of justice, even on behalf of the state, but to be engaged in the works of mercy. The Christian church, and because of Jesus Christ and the crucifixion, his passion, death, and resurrection, we have had revealed to us an entirely different pathway, which is the pathway of drawing life from death instead of death from life. So my own view is that broad sweep of Orthodox thought is that we are called to do everything we can do to call life from death. So when the state exercises something like, to me, as horrific as capital punishment, when the state does that, we need to mourn. And we need to do everything we can do to try and pull life from death under those circumstances. We have interesting examples of it historically. Certainly, as you know, the first Christian calendar was a martyr's calendar. So we use the calendar which was reformed by Pope Gregory. That's the common calendar in our society. Some Orthodox people continue to use the Julian calendar, which is an imperial Roman calendar, by an emperor who was also a persecutor of Christians. But the early Christian calendar was a martyr's calendar. They reflected on those men and women who had borne witness to the gift of God's grace in their life, who even some of them when they were dying, even some of them when they were dying cruelly, were able to forgive, as Jesus Christ did from the cross, those who were pulling death from life. So if we want to speak in a strict way about Orthodox teaching, as opposed to speaking about Orthodox countries where you may have a church which is in liege with the state and thus begins to do the state's bidding, that's a historical and sociological phenomena. The central teaching of the church, absolutely central, is that every human being is the image of God, no matter what they have done, no matter what they believe. The central teaching of the church is we are to nurture communion in all circumstances. The central teaching of the church is that even in our suffering, God comes to us. So the stance of faith, it seems to me, is always one of seeking, in the case of people that have harmed others and are imprisoned, I work in prisons a bit, seeking to pull life from death, even in those circumstances.